Today we have a very special guest joining us, Belinda Labatte. With her CFA, MBA, and ICDD, Belinda has more than 15 years of senior management experience in mining in the extractives industry and 20 years of capital markets experience, including a decade of strategic development, capital markets investment banking, stakeholder engagement, and asset acquisition and disposition processes. Her most recent position was Chief Development Officer for Mandalay Resources. Thanks again for joining us on The Rocks. If you like what you hear and want to catch past conversations, please be sure to subscribe. Now let's dive in. So Belinda, thank you so much for coming on The Rocks this week. It's great to have you on with us.
I'm happy to be here, Emily.
Awesome. And I am drinking Reservoir bourbon. I like that it's a mining themed name. How about yourself? What are you having to drink?
Wow, it's very colorful, like the art behind me. It's orange. It's got carrots and oranges in here and turmeric. Yeah, I'll do the bourbon or the wine a little bit later.
People have no idea what time it is that we're drinking, but a lot of times it is a day drinking taping that we're doing today, just for everyone's reference. Well, as you and I were chatting, getting ready for this, you hit on a word that really stuck out for me, which was optimism, and how you feel and what you're thinking and your team and your board are thinking about the critical mineral space. And I thought, wow, how cool that is, because I was on a separate podcast called The Arc, which is done by SciArt, an architecture school. And the topic that the host was asking me about was optimism. And she actually asked me, like, do you think that mining and exploration is an optimistic industry? And I said, I don't know how much more optimistic you can get if you're willing to like send crazy geologists out into the middle of nowhere to look for rocks and just like know that at some point you're going to find something worth something, and you're going to be able to raise a bunch of money to like build this crazy thing to like extract metal out of rocks that most people would have no idea are worth any money. Like, I personally think that we are about as optimistic as you can get when you look at the mining industry.
That is absolutely true. What's so interesting to me about critical minerals, if we shift from and get more narrow on, what that looks like. So there's 30 or so that have been identified in Canada, about 30 critical minerals in the United States as well, and the same amount in Europe. It's not just about the rock. It's about the entire supply chain. And I think where I'm so keen to ensure that we have an optimistic perspective, it's to say that we can and will develop that resource endowment in our own countries and not rely on before what was, global trade, and you could get that mineral from wherever, and you didn't necessarily know how it was being developed or extracted. So to me, it's actually looking at it from a really big picture and saying, well, what does that optimism really need to look like? And why do we have to be optimistic? And I've worked all over the world myself, and I'm a Canadian. I'm originally from Quebec, born in Montreal, or just in the outskirts of Montreal. And I was like, I think I want to do this differently now, like for this next part of my career, because I love working internationally. And I really wanted to see and think about, what am I going to do in my country for Canadians? And what does that look like? That to me is where I'm pivoting my optimism.
How do you see what you and your team are doing as something that's going to benefit and bring things home to Canadians? What's your vision for that?
Part of the story is how we actually came together as a team before we even had a company. So how about that? You mentioned PDAC earlier. I started looking at critical minerals when I attended that conference virtually in March, not this year, but last year. And that is when I started to realize that I wanted to get involved in this space, and I didn't want to do it alone. So I'm somebody who's done a lot of things on her own. First of all, I'm an only child, and I built my business on my own as a consulting business. And I've done a lot of things by myself. And so I knew that whatever I do next, I want to come together as a team, and they're going to motivate me, and we're going to motivate each other. So what we did is we started talking about, what does it look like to be in critical minerals? But more importantly, from our perspective, what should it look like 5 years from now? What does a meaningful new energy company look like? So beyond just critical minerals. And so that was really what motivated our team, and that sense of optimism around not what's currently happening and what does it currently look like, but what are we building towards? That was really how we came together. We started to look at which jurisdiction. And to me, it was all about Quebec because I love speaking French. It's where I'm from. And I think it's the best place in which to do business. There's a lot of investment funds there. There's a lot of goodwill towards early stage companies. And when I met Paul, who was my predecessor at Lomiko, and I said, how do you feel about this vision? And we talked about what should a company look like 5 years from now and the various levers that we need to move. And then how can we move the project that we have so that, going really narrow, we have a graphite project in Quebec. We have a lithium project that's early stage greenfields. The graphite project is at the PEA stage, but we want to be part of creating a bigger opportunity around critical minerals in Quebec for Canadians. It all starts with your values, and those values about performance and about working with integrity. And that to me is where the optimism comes from. It's people who have a similar vision, values, and mindset.
I think that's so spot on, Belinda. And I oftentimes reflect on a saying that my husband uses. He comes out of the special operations community in the U.S. military. And he says, you can have a terrible mission, but an amazing team, and you'll pull it off every time, right? You can have the opposite. You can have a great mission with a terrible team, and it's really hard to get your way to the end, right? But team is everything. And I think values absolutely goes along with that 100%.
Yeah. Vince, who's the CFO, and how did I meet him? He was my Krav Maga partner. So we trained in self-defense for years together. We did our instructor course together. So we had the same values. And the fact that he was in finance and I was in mining, I was like, I need somebody with his skill set. But from a values perspective, I already knew I would trust him 100% and he trusts me 100%.
Yeah. Looking at our team at Prospector as an example, John Godbout, who's my COO, he and I have worked together. This is like our third thing we've done together now. When I'm starting something new, and I know it's a little bit crazy, but I need someone who I trust 100%, who personally, but also I know can pull anything off, like John's who I call, right? And when you know how you work together or what your value system is, it makes a huge impact in the performance of the company and building a team and attracting great talent, right? There's so much impact when you have the right leadership that trusts each other and works well together. For listeners who may not be super familiar with the critical minerals space, they probably heard you say graphite and they're thinking like pencils. Could you explain why is graphite a critical mineral? How is it used?
Yeah, so pencils. In fact, you'll see that I've got artwork behind me. Graphite has been used for centuries, right? As a material in which to draw and write with. And that is one of its uses. But graphite has many uses. It is a very strong thermal conductor. It has a black kind of substance to it. It can also be used in the refractory industry for steel making. And it is used in the lithium-ion battery in the anode capacity. So when you're putting an electric vehicle car together and you start to look at, well, what's that engine look like? It comes from the battery, and the anode material is 95% graphite. So by weight, it is the heaviest material that is used in that electric vehicle battery. The only place you can get that material is by mining it. And currently, up until very recently, it was always thought of as something that you can get from anywhere. It wasn't really deemed important. And I want to just talk about why that is, because electric vehicles in our society, and I'll talk Canada specifically here, 3.5% of the vehicles on the road are electric. Well, 2035 is when we're supposed to have 100% vehicles sold that are electric. That's going to be 1 million plus vehicles on the road, all electric. So that's just one country and one very particular use. And so that penetration rate really hasn't occurred. So graphite, if you look at it from a historical perspective, doesn't look anything like what it's going to look like from a go forward perspective. The demand is going to grow by 500% because of these penetration rates, because we are not going back to a hydrocarbon economy at all. It's just not going to happen with carbon taxes, with the way that we're moving forward, wanting to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So graphite has a very specific use in the electric vehicle space. It is also used in solar panels, so renewable energy at large, charging stations, all of that are going to be requiring more graphite. And in Canada, 70% of the projects being developed at a meaningful pace are coming from Canada, but up to now, 100% is being processed in China.
So with your project, are you focused just on the mining side with graphite, or are you also tackling the processing side?
Great question. And so we are looking at La Loutre in Quebec. We have crystalline flake graphite, which is what most deposits are in Canada. You're going to be mining a concentrate, and that's going to be 95, 96% carbon. And then to get it to the battery material, you need to go through this purification process, a coating process, and then it becomes spherical graphite, which you can then put into the anode battery. And for that, you need 99.9% purity. I think that it is essential that any company that is mining graphite look at the next value added manufacturing of that. Because if we don't, we're simply shipping it out to China, and we're really not doing anything for this new circular economy that we want to see here. We're not really looking at a fully developed electric vehicle in this country, and we should, right? We can manufacture these cars here. We can work with our neighbors in the United States to develop the spherical graphite and the anode battery material, and eventually working with the Teslas of the world, and all of the automakers are looking at electric vehicles at this point. So we certainly are looking at a circular model, and that is what I think is really exciting for our board. Our board came together. They're all very strategic individuals and really want to be part of what does a meaningful critical minerals company look like 5 years from now? How do we build that? How do we as entrepreneurs, as business people, develop the model from evolving from purely thinking about the mining focus to creating scale in critical minerals or even in graphite itself, and then moving that forward and saying, okay, we're going to want to develop that battery facility or have linkages with the battery manufacturers in Canada, in Quebec. And that's really what we need to do. And we're at the early stages, so it's a very exciting time to be involved with us because we're building. We're actually taking the PEA to PFS, meaning we're building out the resource. We're doing exploration work, infill, extension drilling, while we're looking at metallurgical work for exactly the kind of thing that you're asking, which is what product are we going to be developing? And right now it looks very good that we can create spherical graphite from our flake graphite deposit in Quebec.
I think that's a really important point for listeners that I always reinforce when we're talking about a specific mineral or metal or commodity, that, when people think of mining, they think of like gold mining, and they think every gold mine is going to produce literal gold bars. In just about every commodity, it's really rare to produce an end product within that mine or even within that same company. When we hear people talk about metallurgy and economic assessments, feasibility assessments, part of what you're trying to do in the mining industry is de-risk your project at every stage and really clearly define with what comes out of those rocks, what is the best product that you can then sell for another company, whether it's a trader or a refinery, to take on and make a finished product. Right. And I think that's what I hear you referencing. That's really important for people to understand, that there are a lot of technical aspects within graphite, but critical minerals in general, like there's a lot of different products that these mines will eventually produce. Lithium's another one, right? There's so many different lithium products now that different battery makers need or other consumers need. And every deposit that's a lithium project or a graphite project is not going to produce the same thing. right? It all depends on the rocks and how they're built and how we have to crush them up and separate them, right?
That's right. And, having worked in gold for many, many years and supported companies extracting gold, it is a mature industry. And I really like that it's evolving into being more environmentally responsible and more transparent in how they do things. What I think is so exciting about critical minerals is here's a chance to rethink how we do everything. And we're not a price taker. We're a price maker in that we can look at the market and decide how much we're going to produce and to whom, and we can generate potentially a brand around where your material is coming from because it's sustainably sourced, it's reliable, it's secure, it's coming from a jurisdiction that has all kinds of rules and regulations. For example, in Quebec, they're developing this eco-logo process, which is to have a third-party validation, an independent validation around how you do business and how you explore and how you mine that product eventually. And eco-logo is something that we're working towards, which basically says, yes, people have looked at your policies and your processes. You have that validation around how you're going to generate your project in terms of exploration. There's a different process called towards sustainable mining once you become a developer and a miner. And so that to me is what's really exciting about working in graphite is you can look at your plant and you can say, okay, I don't have to work with an old plant. I'm going to start new. I want to be carbon neutral. Maybe I even want to be a carbon withdrawer, right? And be carbon negative. And so planning ahead for that is to me exciting. And I think that is the message that every Canadian, every North American should really know, because if we want to be decarbonizing our economy, we really need to understand what that supply chain looks like. And we need to take hold of that and create a supply chain that is domestic.
Yeah. And we can't bash the other countries or geographies that are producing at a higher carbon footprint if we're not willing to basically do it in our own backyard, right? And do it with the values that we ascribe to hold, right? So at some point, we have to get behind domestic, or kind of, I consider it essentially domestic, US, Canadian, and to a certain extent, Mexico, I would say as well. Like, we need to get supportive of projects here in North America and put our money where our mouth is, that these things are important to us.
Well, what does that look like? What kinds of things do we need to do to be able to create validation for developing that in our backyard? And for that to happen, you need to be working with all kinds of different community partners. And you need to be flexible. For example, one of the things that has been brought up in our project, we're situated in a community ecosystem and there are lake areas around us. We're not a fly in, fly out. So it's not like we have to worry about access to electricity or power. We have that. But it's, for example, it's road access. So how can we be flexible in terms of using roads where we're not creating congestion during a busy summer season? If we are going to develop our land and our resource endowment in our countries, then we must be thinking about land acknowledgement and First Nations. And to me, that means engagement and conversation.
No, and to your credit, I mean, I talk to a lot of mining executives, and I tend to give a lot of them a hard time due to lack of diversity on management teams and boards. And I, just want to give a shout out that folks who are passionate about that diverse leadership should really check out who makes up your management team and your board. You guys have a really diverse leadership cadre, and just a shout out for that. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what kind of difference that makes as you're growing your team and your company and putting that vision forward for where you want to be in 5 years.
I guess it goes back to, growing up in Quebec and being in a high school where there was so much diversity that I didn't even see it. And now I appreciate it because I was around people who spoke Arabic, who spoke Spanish, who spoke French, English. Everybody spoke a second language. Look around the communities that you're working. Are you reflecting your community? That is what's important. So it's not so much about what the investor is looking for. To me is, am I reflecting the interests of the people I want to be doing business with? And I want to think like a small business person. I want to think like the corner store. And, having a community right now in this community that I'm in, when I founded this business with my daughter, an art business, so that's why you're seeing some art behind me, we really were thinking about what is it like to be in the community. And this is where I think the mining industry needs to go back and think about yourself as a human being, as a small business person. What would you do if you were just a small business? How would you interact with people? And if you can start to have that mindset of learning and understanding how other people think, that's what diverse thinking is all about. It's about people who have different experiences, who are qualified in a different way, and who bring different perspectives to the table. And when you surround yourself with people like that, you get a really interesting, rich conversation around the table where the discourse is going to take into account different points of view and where you have even a difference of opinion more often. And that's what I like.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, especially for mining companies, because along the same lines of that optimism, the whole value proposition for people to become involved in our industry and invest in our industry is this pipeline gap, right? Of all the metal and minerals that the world is going to need for this low carbon future, renewable energy, electric vehicles, things that people haven't even invented yet, right? And the pace of technology change is way outstripping the pace with which we discover and build mines. So we're going to need minerals in 5 years that we're not even paying attention to right now. And the only way, in my opinion, that you begin to be able to adapt as an industry and catch up and close that gap is by having teams that are focused on the problems of the future and not the problems of the now, right? And so even more than, what does our community look like right now, where we're operating and who we want to serve and the communities we want to act as stewards to from an environmental sense, but what is our community going to look like in 5, 10, 20 years? Right? And how does our leadership reflect that? So we're looking ahead and foreseeing challenges or opportunities where we're 10 years ahead of everybody else, right? Is one of the things that I really talk about with my team a lot. Yeah, everybody's got like a revenue target and a sales target and raising money, right, every quarter. But where are we in 5 years? And how do we make sure we're early and not late for that, right?
It's reverse engineering, and it's saying, well, what do you think is important 5 years from, even for me personally, or for yourself personally? You ask yourself, what's important to you 5 years from now? And what actions am I taking today to get me there? Over COVID, I did this crazy thing. I'm like, okay, I love running and I'm going to run because what else is there to do? And I was like, okay, I'm going to run a marathon. Well, there are no marathons. So I ran it myself. So what that taught me is, and it wasn't the marathon I thought I was going to run. It was hard. My music ran out halfway through. Everything went wrong. Phone ran out of battery because, they're not always that reliable. The vision is one thing, but it informs what you do day to day. And those day to day things is I'm going to run 30 kilometers that day, and next weekend it's going to be 35. You don't make those decisions unless you have a vision. And I think we need to go back to, and maybe this is a really nice segue back to the original thing, the optimism. Well, vision is always, or should always, be optimistic. It shouldn't be about what we cannot do or the fact that the government isn't doing enough or whatever negative story or headline you're reading. It's what can we do and what are we doing today to really manifest a vision where we have a reliable source of critical minerals, where it's sustainably produced, where the community is benefiting at every step of the way. I don't have all the answers to it, I can tell you that, nor do I need to. I think it's about bringing people in and saying, well, let's figure it out together, because I'd rather do that than sit on the sidelines and say, there's so much work to be done. We're never going to get there.
Cheers to that. Absolutely. 100% agree. And I would say I've been asking my guests lately as like a last question. And I think that's probably a great lead in for this is, if you could just wave your magic wand and change one thing about the mining industry, what would it be?
Oh, I will tell you what's on my mind. There's probably a lot of things, but I would love to see, given the need we have to develop early stage projects all the way through from PEA to permitting. What I would really like to see is large institutional or pension fund investors coming together and developing a venture capital fund that will invest, similar to the tech mindset, invest in early stage mining, because we are still very much reliant on retail investors. And I would really like to see them sharing risk, because I know they don't want to necessarily invest small amounts of money, that we might be looking for, but yet they want to support this industry, come together, create one or two different types of venture capital funds specifically for critical minerals or battery metals to invest in companies like ours who are doing the right thing, who are constituted the right way, who have good corporate governance, and say, okay, together we're going to give you the money that you need. And I think that this is something I've brought up in various forums where we're coming together to talk about our challenges. And I would love to see that happen and be part of the recipient of such funding.
It's interesting what you pointed out about the industry's reliance on retail investors for early stage and therefore, by their nature, risky investments, right? It does seem a little bit strange that it's flip-flopped in that way.
There's no way we can change the supply chain dynamics without that type of funding. I mean, the United States is import dependent on 14 of the 30 critical minerals, like 100% import dependent. And then they're, about 50% reliant on imports for another 10 critical minerals. When you think about the opportunity we have to develop our resource endowment that we have by moving forward projects that are in the inferred category, so they're not yet deemed economic, and moving them forward so that we really understand better what kind of reserves we have, and doing it in partnership with First Nations and communities, we need funding for that, and we need it to be meaningful, we need it to be accessible, and we need it to be available quickly, because it takes a long time, as you know, to get a project from exploration to production. I think that the number is somewhere like 12 years. If we are going to decarbonize and reduce our carbon footprint by 50% by 2030, well, then we don't have the time where we can take one project forward, right? Like, we needed to get into production in 5 years, not 15. So we have to be moving our deposits forward in a meaningful way. And I just think we're missing an opportunity here to do some really great things simply because of access to capital.
Absolutely. I'll raise my glass to that again. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I really look forward to having you on again soon to hear about how the project is progressing and how the team is doing.
Oh, I'd love that.
Thank you to our guest and my colleague, Belinda Labatte, for joining us on this episode of On the Rocks. To learn more about Belinda and her work, visit her on LinkedIn or on Lomiko.com. For more insights on new mining projects, mining news, and more, go to our website at prospectorportal.com and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Nugget. Thanks for joining us on The Rocks. If you enjoyed the episode, click the subscribe button and please leave a review. Until next time, keep your glasses full and your ice cold. Cheers.